The first time they called the police on me, I honestly thought someone had made a mistake. I mean, who calls law enforcement because a man is living quietly on his own land? But by the fifth time they showed up at my driveway, I finally understood something. This was never about a misunderstanding. It was about control. They wanted my cabin gone. They wanted my property to look like it belonged to their perfect little neighborhood. And they believed if they pushed hard enough, I would eventually give up and leave. What they never realized was that the one thing keeping their expensive community running was something buried underneath my forest, something they had been using for years without ever asking if they still had the right to use it. My name is Ethan Walker. I was 43 years old when all of this happened, and at the time, I had spent almost 20 years working as a forestry consultant across the southeastern United States. My job took me everywhere, from huge private timber properties to small family farms with old barns and forgotten trails. And after years of living out of hotels, eating dinner alone, and waking up to another work call before sunrise, I started realizing I was tired of always being somewhere but never actually being home. I wanted something simple. I wanted a place where I could hear the wind instead of traffic, where I could spend my mornings walking through trees instead of staring at computer screens, where nobody cared what kind of car I drove or whether my house matched some neighborhood color chart. That search eventually brought me to 5 acres of wooded land outside a small mountain community in northern Georgia. The property was not impressive by most people's standards. There was no giant driveway, no modern kitchen, no luxury features that real estate agents love putting in bold letters. It had an old 1972 cedar cabin sitting quietly between rows of tall pine trees, a weathered metal roof, faded wooden walls, and floors inside that carried decades of history. The place smelled like old oak, pine resin, and the kind of memories you can almost feel but never fully explain. The first night I stayed there, I sat on the front porch with a cheap cup of coffee, watching the sun disappear behind the trees, and I remember thinking, this is exactly where I was supposed to end up. Then I looked toward the eastern edge of my property and saw my new neighbors. About 100 yards away was a development called Willow Creek Reserve, a community with 52 luxury townhomes, perfectly trimmed landscaping, decorative stone walls, outdoor lighting, and the kind of homes where every driveway looked like it belonged in a magazine. They had private security signs, a community clubhouse, and a homeowners association that seemed to have rules for everything from mailbox colors to what time of year someone could put up decorations. I had none of that. I had a deed, a survey, and 5 acres of forest that belonged to me. At first, I thought that was exactly why things would work out. I assumed people who lived nearby would appreciate having someone who cared about the land. I assumed my quiet lifestyle would not bother anyone. I was wrong. 3 days after moving in, I found a laminated envelope attached to my front door. There was no introduction, no welcome note, no simple hello from my new neighbors. It was a formal notice from the Willow Creek Reserve Homeowners Association. I remember standing there on my porch, reading the first sentence, then reading it again because I genuinely thought I misunderstood it. The letter said my property created an inconsistency with the visual standards of the surrounding community. Then came the demands. They wanted my grass maintained at a specific height. They wanted my cabin painted a neutral color approved by the association. They wanted old equipment near my storage shed removed because it created what they described as an undesirable rural appearance. I actually laughed when I finished reading it, not because it was funny, but because it was so unbelievable that my brain needed a second to process it. I looked around at my own property, at the trees I legally owned, at the cabin I had worked hard to buy, and I thought, are these people serious? That afternoon, I pulled out every document from the purchase. I checked my deed, my survey, my title paperwork, everything. I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing some tiny detail buried in the fine print. But there it was, plain as day. My property was independent. There was no HOA covenant, no shared agreement, no restrictions tying my land to Willow Creek Reserve. Their rules stopped exactly where their property line ended, so I did what I thought any reasonable person would do. I ignored the letter. Looking back, that was the moment the situation changed, because to someone like Caroline Whitmore, the president of the HOA, silence was not acceptance. Silence was disrespect. Caroline was 59 years old, and I had seen her around the neighborhood before. She drove a spotless black SUV, wore expensive-looking clothes even when she was just walking around the community, and carried herself like she was the person responsible for maintaining order in the entire county. A few days after I ignored the letter, She walked onto my property without permission. I was outside cutting a fallen branch when I heard her voice behind me. Mr. Walker? I turned around and saw her standing near my driveway holding a clipboard. Can I help you? I asked. She looked past me toward my cabin, then slowly looked around at the trees like she was inspecting something that had failed an inspection. I'm hoping we can resolve this before it becomes a bigger issue, she said. I remember that sentence because it sounded less like a conversation and more like a warning. What issue? I asked. She pointed toward my cabin. Your property affects the appearance of our community. I looked behind her toward the rows of expensive townhomes. Your community is over there, I said calmly. Her expression changed immediately. It was small, but I noticed it, the kind of reaction someone has when they are not used to hearing the word no. That attitude is exactly the problem, she replied. And right then, I understood this was never about the grass, the paint, or the appearance of anything. This was about authority. Caroline had spent years inside a world where rules on paper gave people power over others, and my little cabin in the woods represented something she could not control. I thought that was the end of it. I thought eventually she would realize my property was private and move on. But I was about to learn that some people do not stop when they lose an argument. They simply find a different way to fight, and Caroline Whitmore had just started. The second I realized Caroline Whitmore was not going to let this go, I stopped thinking of her as an annoying neighbor and started paying attention. People like Caroline rarely explode all at once. They test boundaries first. They see how much they can push before someone pushes back. And for the next few weeks, that was exactly what happened. She tried everything she could to make me feel like I did not belong there. A few days after our conversation, I found another notice taped to my gate. This one was less polite. It mentioned possible legal action, possible fines, and the phrase community integrity several times, which was interesting because my property was not part of her community in the first place. I kept every letter. I kept every envelope. I kept every message because something in my gut told me I would need a record of all of it eventually. Then came the first police visit. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was repairing part of the old fence line on the western side of my property when a county deputy pulled into my driveway. He stepped out slowly, looking more confused than serious. Mr. Walker? He asked. Yes? We received a complaint that you are trespassing on private community land. For a second, I honestly thought he had the wrong address. Then I saw Caroline's SUV parked at the edge of the road. She was sitting inside watching. I walked over, grabbed my property survey from the cabin, and showed him the boundary markers. I explained where my land started, where Willow Creek Reserve ended, and how my cabin had been there long before the new development was built. The deputy studied the paperwork, walked the edge of the property, then came back and handed it to me. Looks like you're right, sir. This is private property. He looked uncomfortable, like he knew he had been sent on a pointless trip. Before leaving, he gave me some advice. Keep documenting everything. I nodded because I already had a feeling this was not over. I was right. 12 days later, another deputy showed up. Same complaint, same accusation, same result. Then 2 weeks after that, a third visit. At that point, I almost wanted to laugh because it became predictable. I would hear a vehicle coming up the gravel road. I would walk outside, and there would be another officer standing there with the same confused expression. But Caroline was not embarrassed. She was escalating. The final warning came in the form of a letter from an attorney. According to Caroline, my cabin was damaging property values in Willow Creek Reserve, and they were considering a lawsuit seeking $25,000 in damages. I sat at my kitchen table reading that letter while the rain tapped against the old windows of my cabin, and I remember feeling something I had not felt in years. Anger. Not the kind of anger where you lose control, the kind where everything suddenly becomes very clear. I had spent my entire adult life respecting people's property. I had helped landowners protect forests, preserve boundaries, and avoid disputes. I believe neighbors should solve problems by talking, but Caroline was not interested in solving anything. She wanted compliance. She wanted me to accept rules she had no legal authority to enforce. So instead of arguing with her, I decided to do something else. I decided to understand every inch of my property. That weekend, I walked my entire 5 acres. Not casually, but carefully, like I was studying it for the first time. I followed old trails, checked survey markers, inspected drainage paths, and looked at areas I had not paid attention to since moving in. That was when I noticed something strange. Along the northern edge of my property, Hidden beneath years of leaves and overgrown vegetation, I found a line of white PVC pipes entering my land. At first, I assumed they belonged to an old system from the previous owner, but the farther I followed them, the more confused I became. The pipes were not random. They were carefully installed. They ran from the direction of Willow Creek Reserve and continued underground toward a concrete structure behind my cabin. I spent the next few hours clearing the area around it, and what I found made me sit there quietly for a long time. It was an access point to a large wastewater system. Their wastewater system, all 52 townhomes, were connected to a septic treatment system located on my property. I could not believe it. The same people who had been telling me my cabin was lowering their property value had been depending on my land every single day. I went back inside and started digging through the old paperwork from when I bought the property. I found documents from the previous owner, a man named Harold Benson, who had owned the cabin since the late 1990s. Buried in the files was an access agreement from 1998. It explained that Willow Creek's original developers had permission to run wastewater lines through the property and maintain the system. But there was one important detail. Caroline and her HOA apparently forgot to mention. The agreement had an expiration date. It expired in February 2023, more than a year before Caroline ever stepped onto my property and started giving me orders. There had been no renewal, no new contract, no updated agreement, nothing. They were using my land based on a permission that no longer existed. I sat there looking at those papers, and honestly, I felt two completely different emotions at the same time. Part of me was angry, really angry, because these people had called the police on me, threatened me, and treated me like an outsider while they were literally relying on something I owned. But another part of me knew I had to be careful. I did not want revenge. I wanted fairness. There is a big difference. So I did not cut anything immediately. I did not damage the system. I did not make some dramatic move just because I could. Instead, I contacted a property attorney, reviewed the documents, and made sure I understood exactly where I stood. The answer was clear. The access agreement was over. If they wanted continued use of my property, they needed a new agreement, a real one that respected both sides. I prepared a formal notice explaining that access to the wastewater system would end after 14 days unless a new legal agreement was reached. I sent it through certified mail. I also sent copies to the HOA board and the county records office. Then I waited. The first day, nothing happened. No calls, no messages, no apology. Caroline probably assumed I was bluffing. The second day, still nothing. By the third day, I started wondering if they would actually force me to take the next step. Then my phone rang. It was a number from Willow Creek Reserve. I watched it ring. I did not answer, because for the first time since I moved in, I was not reacting to Caroline's demands. I was letting her deal with the consequences of ignoring someone else's rights. And somewhere across those perfectly trimmed lawns and expensive driveways, 52 homeowners were about to discover that the one thing they never thought about, the thing hidden beneath the ground, was the one thing they could not live without. By the 7th day after my notice was sent, Willow Creek Reserve looked completely different. The neighborhood that had always seemed so perfect, so carefully designed and controlled, suddenly felt like a place where everyone was waiting for something bad to happen. I started hearing from a few residents who had never spoken to me before. Some were angry at first, because Caroline had told them I was trying to hurt the community. But when they actually looked at the documents, when they realized the truth about the expired agreement, their anger started changing direction. They began asking questions that Caroline did not want to answer. By day 10, the HOA had already spent thousands of dollars on emergency solutions. Temporary pumping trucks were coming in and out of the neighborhood, and large holding tanks were sitting along streets that were usually photographed for real estate advertisements. It was almost surreal seeing a place that had always looked untouchable suddenly dealing with a problem nobody could hide. Then Caroline showed up at my cabin. But this time, she was different. The confidence was gone. The clipboard was gone. The attitude was gone. She stood on my porch looking exhausted, holding a folder against her chest. "Ethan, we need to talk," she said. I opened the door but stayed quiet. She looked around at the cabin she'd once described as an eyesore. "I think we may have handled this situation badly." I almost smiled because that was probably the closest thing to an apology I was ever going to get from her. I invited her inside and placed a folder on the table. Inside were records showing years of maintenance I had paid for after taking ownership of the property, inspections, repairs, and expenses connected to keeping the system functional. The total was $46,000. This is what I spent maintaining a system your community used for years, I said. Caroline looked through the papers quietly. Then I explained my terms. If Willow Creek wanted continued access, they needed a legitimate agreement, a 25-year contract, proper payments, regular inspections, written approval before any future changes affected my property, and most importantly, they needed to acknowledge that my land was not part of their HOA. Caroline looked up at me and said, "You cannot hold an entire community hostage." I remember that moment clearly because I realized she still did not understand. "I'm not holding anyone hostage," I told her. "I'm giving you the same choice you should have given me from the beginning. Respect my property, and we can work together. Ignore my rights, and you deal with the consequences of your own decisions." She did not say anything after that. She just picked up the folder and left. 2 days later, the HOA board contacted me. They were ready to negotiate. On day 14, the agreement was signed. They paid the outstanding maintenance costs, created a new 25-year access contract, and recorded the agreement officially. Caroline also signed a written statement acknowledging that my property was privately owned and outside the authority of Willow Creek Reserve. They rebuilt parts of the connection under my inspection, and when everything was finished, the wastewater system started working again. The neighborhood went back to normal. The trucks disappeared. The temporary tanks were removed. The lawns looked perfect again. But something had changed, not just for them, but for me. I learned that protecting your peace sometimes requires standing up when people assume you will stay quiet. I never wanted a fight with my neighbors. I never wanted their money or their problems. I just wanted the same respect I was willing to give them. My cabin stayed exactly the way it was, surrounded by trees, wildlife, and the quiet I had searched for all those years. And every morning when I stepped onto that porch, I remembered something simple. Land is more than just dirt. It represents choices, history, and the right to decide what happens on your own piece of the world. Now I want to hear what you think. Was I right to enforce my property rights, or should I have found another way to handle the situation? If you were in my position, after being threatened and pushed around for weeks, what would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments. Because these kinds of conflicts are never just about land, they are about respect, boundaries, and knowing when it is time to stand your ground. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to share it with someone who believes every person deserves to have their voice heard.